You're pulled over for rolling through a stop sign. The officer walks up to your window and asks if there's anything in the car he should know about. You've got a legally owned handgun in the glove box and a valid carry permit in your wallet. You think being up front is the smart move. You tell him about the gun. You even offer to show him where it is. 20 minutes later, you're standing on the shoulder watching strangers search through your belongings while your kids sit confused in the back seat. That moment of honesty just turned a $10 ticket into a full vehicle search, and you didn't break a single law. Most people believe that being honest with police is always the right call. They think cooperation equals protection. But when it comes to firearms, honesty without strategy can cost you everything. The officer isn't your friend during a traffic stop. He's doing his job, and part of that job is gathering information that can be used later. Every word you say is being recorded. Every gesture is being interpreted. And the difference between walking away with a warning and walking away in cuffs often comes down to understanding one thing. You don't have to answer every question just because someone with a badge asks it. Here's what makes this so dangerous. Most gun owners have no idea how much power they're giving away the moment they start talking. They think the law protects them automatically because they followed the rules. They bought the gun legally, they got the permit, they stored it properly, so they assume that means they're safe. But permits don't stop searches. Compliance doesn't prevent arrests, and being polite doesn't mean you won't end up in a courtroom months later trying to explain why you said what you said. The system isn't built to protect you just because you're a lawful gun owner. It's built to gather evidence, and if you don't know how to navigate that, you're going to lose. If you want to understand how to protect yourself during these interactions, not just physically but legally, then you need to hear what comes next. Because the strategies I'm about to explain will give you the tools to stay calm, stay lawful, and avoid handing over your rights without even realizing it. This isn't about being difficult. It's about being smart. Now let's talk about what most people get wrong. They think the Second Amendment means they can carry a gun anywhere, anytime, as long as they're not breaking the law. And on paper, that sounds right. But in practice, the moment you tell an officer you have a firearm, the entire interaction changes. It doesn't matter that you're legal. It doesn't matter that you've done nothing wrong. The second that officer hears the word gun, his training kicks in. He's not thinking about your rights. He's thinking about his safety. And that shift in focus is what leads to searches, seizures, and arrests that never needed to happen. Here's the part nobody talks about. When you disclose a weapon during a traffic stop, you're not just being honest. You're giving the officer a reason to escalate. Suddenly, this isn't a conversation about a broken taillight. It's a weapons encounter. Backup gets called. The tone gets serious, and now the officer has legal justification to secure the scene, which often means securing you and everything you own. Studies show that traffic stops involving disclosed firearms are far more likely to result in searches even when there's no probable cause for a crime. That's not because officers are bad people. It's because the system trains them to treat every disclosed weapon as a potential threat. And once that button is pushed, it's almost impossible to unpush it. So what should you do instead? The answer isn't to lie. Lying to an officer will get you arrested faster than anything else. If they find a gun after you said you didn't have one, you've just committed a crime. And in most states, that crime alone is enough to revoke your permit permanently. But the answer also isn't to volunteer information that wasn't asked for. There's a middle path, and it's the one that keeps you out of trouble. You have to know what you're required to say and what you're allowed to keep to yourself. And that line is different depending on where you live. Some states have what's called a duty to inform law. That means the moment an officer approaches your vehicle, you're legally required to tell him you have a firearm and a permit. If you don't, you're breaking the law. Other states don't have that requirement. In those places, you only have to disclose if the officer specifically asks. And even then, how you answer matters more than you think. Because once you say the word gun, everything that comes after it can be used against you. Not just in that moment, but months or even years later if you ever have to use that firearm in self-defense. Let me give you an example. An officer asks why you carry a gun. You say something like, "You never know what could happen these days." That sounds reasonable. But if you ever end up in court for a self-defense shooting, that statement will be played for the jury. The prosecutor will use it to argue that you were paranoid, that you were looking for trouble, that you wanted an excuse to use your weapon. Your casual explanation during a traffic stop just became evidence of intent. And there's nothing you can do to take it back because it's on video. Body cameras, dashboard cameras, even audio recordings inside the patrol car are capturing everything. And all of that can be subpoenaed later. This is why silence is so powerful. Not rude silence, not hostile silence, but strategic silence. You have a constitutional right not to answer questions that could incriminate you. That's the Fifth Amendment. And it applies to traffic stops just as much as it applies to interrogations at the police station. But here's the catch. Most people don't realize that you have to actually use that right. You can't just stay quiet and hope the officer gets the hint. If you don't formally invoke your Fifth Amendment protection, your silence can be used against you in court. That's a Supreme Court ruling, and it's one of the most misunderstood pieces of law in the entire country. The case that created this mess is called Salinas versus Texas. In that case, a man was being questioned by police. He answered most of their questions, but when they asked him something he didn't want to answer, he just stopped talking. He didn't say he was invoking his rights. He just went silent. Later, prosecutors used that silence as evidence of guilt. They told the jury that an innocent person would have kept talking. The Supreme Court sided with the prosecutors. They ruled that unless you clearly and vocally say you're invoking your Fifth Amendment rights, your silence can be interpreted as suspicious behavior. That ruling changed everything for people in situations like traffic stops. So here's what that means for you. If an officer asks whether you have a weapon and you just sit there quietly, that silence can be used against you. The prosecutor can stand in front of a jury and say, when asked about the gun, he said nothing. That's not what innocent people do. But if you say the words, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right, the law protects you. The officer has to stop questioning you about that topic. And if he keeps pushing, anything you say after that point can be thrown out in court. Those words are a legal shield, but only if you use them correctly. Now, let's talk about what happens if you're in a state that requires you to disclose. In those states, you don't have the option to invoke the Fifth Amendment right away because the law says you have to inform the officer immediately. So what do? You disclose the gun in the calmest, clearest way possible. You say, Officer, I'm required to inform you that I have a valid carry permit and there's a firearm in the vehicle. Then you stop talking. You don't explain where it is unless he asks. You don't offer to show him. You don't reach for anything. You keep your hands visible and you wait for instructions. If he asks follow-up questions, that's when you can consider invoking your Fifth Amendment rights for anything beyond the basic disclosure requirement. The key is understanding that disclosure and cooperation are not the same thing. Disclosure is telling the officer what the law requires you to tell him. Cooperation is answering every question he throws at you, even when you're not legally required to. And that's where people get in trouble. They think being cooperative makes them look innocent, but in reality, it just gives the officer more material to work with. Every answer you give is another piece of information that can be twisted, misinterpreted, or used to justify a search. Let me walk you through what a search looks like once it starts. The officer asks if he can look inside your glove box. You say sure, because you think saying no makes you look guilty. He opens it. He moves the gun aside. Then he sees an old prescription bottle. He picks it up. There's a pill in there that doesn't match the label. Maybe it's just an aspirin you tossed in there months ago. But now the officer has probable cause to search the entire vehicle because he suspects drug possession. 20 minutes ago, this was a traffic stop. Now it's a drug investigation. And it all started because you said the word sure. This is why you never consent to a search. Not because you have something to hide, but because you have rights to protect. If the officer wants to search your car, he needs probable cause or a warrant. If he has neither, and you give him permission, you've just waived your Fourth Amendment rights. And once that happens, anything he finds can be used against you, even if the search turns up nothing related to what he was originally looking for. Courts have repeatedly ruled that once you consent, the scope of the search can expand to include anything the officer thinks is suspicious. So what do you say if an officer asks to search your vehicle? You say, "What? I do not consent to searches." You say it clearly. You say it calmly. You don't argue. You don't explain. You just state your position and let the officer decide what to do next. If he has probable cause, he'll search anyway, and your refusal won't stop him. But if he doesn't have cause, your refusal protects you. And if he searches anyway without cause, your lawyer can get that evidence thrown out later. But if you consented, there's nothing your lawyer can do. You gave up your rights voluntarily. Now let's talk about something even more dangerous. The helpful gesture. The officer says, "For my safety, can you just point to where the gun is?" That sounds like a reasonable request. You're thinking, I'll just show him so he feels comfortable. But legally, pointing to a location in your car can be interpreted as consent to search that area. Courts have ruled that gestures can constitute implied consent. So when you point to the center console, you're not just showing him where the gun is. You're giving him legal permission to open that console and look inside. And once it's open, anything he sees is fair game. This is where people lose control of the situation without realizing it. They think they're being helpful. They think they're making the stop go faster, but they're actually opening the door to a much bigger problem. The officer finds the gun, which is legal. But he also finds something else. Maybe it's a knife that's slightly longer than the legal limit in that state. Maybe it's a magazine with a capacity that's restricted in that jurisdiction. Maybe it's something you didn't even know was in there, left behind by a friend who borrowed your car last month. Now you're being charged with possession of an illegal item, and it all traces back to the moment you pointed. So what should you do instead? You keep your hands on the steering wheel. You don't gesture. You don't reach for anything. If the officer asks where the gun is, you can say, "I'm not comfortable reaching toward it. I'd prefer you secure it yourself if that's necessary." That keeps you safe, keeps the officer safe, and doesn't give implied consent. If he wants to search, he has to make that decision on his own, without your permission. And if he does search without cause, you have a much stronger case later in court. Let's shift to what happens after the stop. Most people think once they drive away, it's over. But the video from that stop lives forever. If you ever have to use your firearm in self-defense, prosecutors will pull every interaction you've ever had with law enforcement. They'll watch those videos looking for anything they can use to paint you as aggressive, reckless, or unstable. And if you said something during a traffic stop that sounds bad out of context, that's going to show up in court. Juries don't see the full picture. They see a 15-second clip of you saying, "I carry because the world is a dangerous place." And the prosecutor tells them that proves you were looking for a fight. This is why every word matters. You're not just talking to the officer in that moment. You're talking to a potential jury months or years from now. And the best way to avoid giving them ammunition is to say as little as possible. You're polite, you're respectful, but you're not chatty. You answer what you're legally required to answer, and nothing more. That discipline protects you in ways most people never think about until it's too late. Here's the bottom line. Gun ownership comes with responsibilities that go way beyond safe handling and proper storage. It comes with the responsibility to understand your legal rights and know how to use them. Because the moment you interact with law enforcement while armed, you're in a high-stakes situation. The officer is trained to control that situation. You need to be trained to protect yourself within it. And that doesn't mean being combative or difficult. It means being informed, being calm, and being strategic. You don't owe the officer your life story. You don't owe him explanations for why you carry or where you're going. You owe him respect, compliance with lawful orders, and the information the law requires you to give. Beyond that, silence is your friend. Invoking your Fifth Amendment rights is your shield, and refusing consent to searches is your legal boundary. Those three tools, used correctly, will keep you out of situations that spiral out of control. If you're still with me, that means you're serious about protecting yourself the right way. And that's exactly the kind of mindset that helps you stay safe and stay free. There's a community of people here who care about understanding these issues deeply, not just reacting to headlines. If that sounds like you, then make sure you're subscribed, because we're going to keep digging into the real, practical side of gun ownership and legal rights. This isn't surface-level stuff. This is the information that makes the difference when it counts. One more thing before we wrap up. If you're traveling across state lines, everything I just said gets even more complicated. Every state has different laws about disclosure, different rules about where you can carry, and different penalties for getting it wrong. You can't assume that what's legal in your home state is legal everywhere. Before you cross a border with a firearm, you need to know the exact requirements of the state you're entering. And if you're just passing through, you need to understand how federal protections work and what they don't cover. Because getting pulled over in the wrong state with the wrong setup can turn a road trip into a legal nightmare. The other thing to keep in mind is that laws change. What was true last year might not be true today. States update their requirements, courts issue new rulings, and if you're not staying informed, you're rolling the dice every time you step out the door with a firearm. That's not fear-mongering, that's reality. The legal landscape is always shifting, and your responsibility as a gun owner is to keep up with it. That means checking your state's laws regularly. That means understanding what duty to inform means where you live. And that means knowing how to invoke your rights when the moment comes. So here's your takeaway. Stay calm, stay respectful, and stay informed. Know what you're required to say. Know when you're allowed to stay silent. Know how to refuse consent without being confrontational. And most importantly, understand that your rights don't protect you unless you use them. A permit is just a piece of plastic. Knowledge is what keeps you free. The next time you see those lights in your mirror, you'll know exactly what to do. You'll keep your hands visible. You'll stay calm. You'll say what the law requires and nothing more. And you'll walk away with your freedom intact. If this breakdown gave you tools you didn't have before, then you're going to want to stick around. Because we're going to keep breaking down the situations that catch people off guard and the strategies that keep them protected. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. Stay sharp, stay legal, and remember, your rights only work if you know how to use them.